On February 26, 2022, 48 hours after Russian tanks crossed the Ukrainian border, the United States and European Union executed an unprecedented maneuver in modern financial history. The decision announced on that cold Saturday would echo far beyond the battlefields of Eastern Europe. Russia would be disconnected from SWIFT, the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication. This wasn't a simple trade embargo or elevated tariffs on strategic exports. It was something radically different. The West was severing the digital arteries that kept the Russian economy connected to the planet. SWIFT isn't an ordinary bank that holds deposits or lends money to governments. It's the central nervous system of global finance, an invisible infrastructure processing coded language between 11,000 banking institutions spread across 200 countries. Daily, $5 trillion flow through its encrypted messages. When a bank in Tokyo needs to transfer funds to another in Frankfurt, SWIFT transmits the authenticated, validated, and traceable instructions. Without access to this network, a financial institution becomes an isolated island in the ocean of international commerce. It cannot receive payments for exports. It cannot send resources for imports. It simply ceases to exist on the map of cross-border transactions. The Russian exclusion meant exactly that. Russian banks could no longer send or receive international payment orders. No trade financing, no foreign currency settlements. Total economic isolation. For Western strategists, this was the nuclear option of financial sanctions, a devastating weapon that would force Moscow to retreat. Predictions were unanimous in Washington and Brussels analysis centers. The ruble would enter irreversible collapse, the Russian economy would implode within weeks, and Vladimir Putin would face unbearable domestic pressure. The narrative was crystal clear: withdraw from Ukraine or face an internal revolution fueled by economic chaos. But 2.5 years after that decisive Saturday, something profoundly unexpected emerged from the rubble of sanctions. Russia didn't collapse. The ruble, which plummeted 30% in the first days of panic, recovered all lost ground in just 3 months. Russian foreign trade continued flowing, simply through channels that didn't pass through SWIFT. Moscow found functional alternatives, adapted, reconfigured its payment networks. And most disturbing for the Western-led financial order, dozens of other nations closely observed every movement of this crisis and began building their own parallel systems, their own escape routes from dollar dominance. The logic behind this reaction is transparent. If Washington could disconnect the world's 11th largest economy from the global financial system for geopolitical reasons, then it could do the same to any other country challenging its strategic interests. It didn't matter if you'd been an ally for decades or a trade partner for generations. What mattered was the brutal demonstration of power. Assets frozen with an executive order, banks isolated with a political decision, economy strangled with a press release. In that moment, every finance minister, every central bank governor, every emerging nation leader asked the same existential question: should we accept permanent vulnerability to American financial power, or should we build alternatives that protect us? The answer, in most cases, was unequivocal. Building alternatives became a national security priority for over 50 countries. But this wasn't the first time in history that a dominant power transformed financial infrastructure into a weapon of war. The pattern has repeated exactly 4 times over the last 110 years, and in all of them, the same inexorable cycle unfolded. The hegemonic power controls the global financial system and decides to use it to punish adversaries. The targets of these punishments find ways to circumvent the blockade. Neutral nations, even those not sanctioned, begin protecting their own interests by diversifying reserves and relationships. And finally, the original weapon loses its devastating effectiveness. The strategic error is always the same. The dominant power believes it's exercising maximum possible leverage, when in reality it's destroying the foundations of its own hegemony. It's a fatal paradox. The act of using financial power as coercion reveals its fragile and arbitrary nature, undermining the trust that sustained that very power. And without trust, no monetary system survives for long. There are 4 historical cases that perfectly illustrate this self-destructive pattern. Each followed a 5-stage script that repeats with almost scientific precision. System control, weaponization for political objectives, search for alternatives by targets, preventive protection by neutral countries, and finally, terminal erosion of the original weapon's power. These stages aren't abstract theory. They're documented facts, supported by data on capital flows, composition of foreign exchange reserves, transaction volumes in alternative currencies, and bilateral trade agreements. And most alarming, this data demonstrates the pattern is unfolding right now, accelerated by digital technology and the collective memory of nations that witnessed Russia's treatment. China emerges as the obvious winner of this process. Beijing doesn't need to confront Washington militarily or challenge American hegemony through devastating trade wars. It simply needs to observe, patiently, while the United States itself erodes the foundation of its financial dominance through excessive use of sanctions. And there's a temporal fact that cannot be ignored. When Great Britain weaponized its finances in 1914, it lost global reserve currency status by 1944, 30 years from the cycle's beginning to its conclusion. The United States weaponized SWIFT in 2022. The clock has started. And this time, the decline will likely be faster because alternatives already exist, are already functioning, have already proven their viability. Technology accelerates all historical processes, and the speed at which digital payment systems can scale globally has no parallel with the analog era of the 20th century. Before understanding how the SWIFT weapon backfired catastrophically, you need to grasp what SWIFT actually is and why its control represents such extraordinary power in the modern global economy. SWIFT doesn't hold money, it doesn't transfer funds, it doesn't act as a clearinghouse or settlement system. SWIFT is purely a messaging infrastructure, a communication protocol that enables financial institutions worldwide to send secure, standardized instructions to one another. When Bank A in New York wants to send $1 million to Bank B in Tokyo, SWIFT doesn't move that money. Instead, it transmits an encrypted, authenticated message that says, Bank A authorizes transfer of $1 million to Bank B, reference number, date, purpose. The actual money moves through correspondent banking relationships, but SWIFT provides the universal language that makes these movements possible across borders, currencies, and legal jurisdictions. SWIFT was born in 1973, created by a consortium of 239 banks across 15 countries. Before its existence, international payments relied on telex systems that were slow, prone to errors, and lacked standardized formats. A single transaction could take days to confirm, and misunderstandings about amounts, currencies, or recipient details were common. SWIFT revolutionized this chaotic landscape by introducing standardized messaging codes, robust security protocols, and a centralized network architecture that made cross-border transactions fast, reliable, and traceable. By 1977, just 4 years after launch, SWIFT was processing 10 million messages annually. By 2024, that number exploded to over 11 billion messages per year, approximately 45 million per day. This exponential growth transformed SWIFT from a banking utility into the indispensable backbone of global commerce. Here's what makes SWIFT extraordinarily powerful beyond its technical capabilities. It's technically neutral, headquartered in Belgium rather than the United States, governed by a board representing member banks from around the world. But beneath this veneer of neutrality lies a critical vulnerability. SWIFT's board is dominated by American and European financial institutions. More importantly, the United States possesses unique legal leverage because the overwhelming majority of international transactions settle in dollars through correspondent banks in New York. The U.S. Treasury Department can threaten sanctions on any bank that continues processing SWIFT messages for blacklisted entities. The Federal Reserve can cut off access to dollar clearing systems. In practice, SWIFT cannot function effectively without American cooperation, which means Washington controls SWIFT by controlling the dollar itself. If you're cut off from SWIFT, the consequences are immediate and severe.
You cannot easily conduct international trade because exporters can't receive payment and importers can't send it. Foreign currency reserves become trapped because you can't move them between international accounts. Your domestic banks become isolated from the global financial system, unable to provide letters of credit, trade financing, or currency exchange services. You're economically quarantined, forced to resort to primitive alternatives like physical cash transfers, barter arrangements, or blockchain cryptocurrencies that lack the scale and stability of traditional banking. The United States has used this weapon before, and the 2022 Russia exclusion wasn't even the first deployment. In 2012, Washington pressured SWIFT to disconnect Iranian banks as part of sanctions aimed at forcing Tehran to abandon its nuclear program. The impact on Iran was devastating and immediate. Oil exports, which had been generating $80 billion annually, collapsed virtually overnight because international buyers couldn't pay through normal banking channels. Iran's economy contracted by 9% in a single year. Inflation surged to 45% as the rial lost value and import costs skyrocketed. The Iranian government, facing economic catastrophe and domestic unrest, was forced to negotiate, eventually leading to the 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the nuclear deal. The SWIFT weapon appeared to work perfectly. Iran was brought to the negotiating table. The nuclear program was constrained. Western policymakers celebrated this as proof that financial warfare could achieve strategic objectives without firing a shot. But beneath the surface, something more complex was happening. During those years of isolation from 2012 to 2015, Iran wasn't sitting idle. Tehran systematically built alternative payment channels. Barter arrangements with Turkey, where Iranian oil was exchanged directly for Turkish goods. Cryptocurrency networks that allowed some transactions to bypass traditional banking. Non-dollar trade agreements with China and Russia that used yuan, rubles, and even physical gold for settlement. When sanctions returned in 2018 after the Trump administration withdrew from the nuclear deal, Iran survived far better than the first time precisely because it had reduced SWIFT dependency and developed workarounds. But the 2022 Russian exclusion operated on an entirely different scale. Iran is a regional power with a $600 billion economy. Russia is the world's 11th largest economy at nearly $2 trillion, a major energy exporter supplying 40% of Europe's natural gas, a nuclear superpower with veto power on the UN Security Council, and a permanent fixture in global geopolitics. Cutting Russia off from SWIFT wasn't merely economic warfare against a mid-sized adversary. It was a declaration that the U.S.-controlled financial system could exclude anyone, regardless of size or significance, for political reasons that Washington alone would define. Every country watching this unfold understood the implicit message with perfect clarity. If you cross American interests on Taiwan, Kashmir, trade policy, human rights, territorial disputes, or any other issue Washington deems important, you risk losing access to the global financial system. Your $1 trillion in foreign reserves held in New York banks could be frozen with an executive order. Your financial institutions could be isolated from SWIFT with a Treasury Department memo. Your economy could be strangled without a single missile being fired or a single soldier crossing your border. This wasn't theoretical speculation. It was documented precedent broadcast live to every capital city on Earth. This created an existential dilemma for every non-Western nation, particularly those with substantial dollar reserves or complex international trade relationships. Do you accept permanent vulnerability to U.S. financial power, trusting that you'll never conflict with Washington on any issue important enough to trigger sanctions? Or do you proactively build alternatives, diversifying away from dollar dependence and SWIFT reliance, even while relations remain friendly? For most countries outside the Western alliance structure, particularly those in Asia, the Middle East, and Latin America, the answer became increasingly obvious. Build alternatives. Hedge your exposure. Never again be completely vulnerable to a single power's arbitrary decisions. And that's precisely when the swift weapon began to backfire, not through dramatic headlines or immediate reversals, but through the quiet, systematic construction of parallel financial infrastructure that would eventually undermine dollar hegemony itself. The weaponization of SWIFT in 2022 didn't just punish Russia, it triggered a global reassessment of financial vulnerability that will reshape the international monetary system for decades to come.
Financial weaponization isn't a modern innovation, it's a recurring pattern in the history of hegemonic powers, and it always backfires through the same predictable mechanism. The dominant power mistakes temporary tactical advantage for permanent strategic strength, failing to recognize that the very act of weaponization destroys the trust and network effects that made the system dominant in the first place. This pattern has repeated 4 times over the last 110 years, and each iteration follows an identical 5-stage framework that we can observe with mathematical precision. Understanding these historical precedents reveals why the 2022 SWIFT exclusion wasn't a demonstration of American power, but rather the beginning of its erosion. The first example occurred in 1914 when Great Britain controlled global finance with an iron grip. Before World War I, the British pound sterling was the undisputed reserve currency of the world, accounting for approximately 65% of international reserves held by central banks. The City of London functioned as the unchallenged center of global finance, where trade was financed, currencies were exchanged, and international debts were settled. Britain's financial dominance was so complete that even nations hostile to British political interests maintained reserves in sterling and conducted international business through London banks, simply because there was no viable alternative. When war erupted in August 1914, Britain passed the Trading with the Enemy Act, legislation that allowed the government to freeze and seize assets belonging to German nationals and companies anywhere within the British Empire's reach. German-owned businesses in London, bank accounts in British territories, ships in Commonwealth ports, all were confiscated. This represented an unprecedented violation of the long-standing principle that finance and war occupied separate spheres. Throughout previous European conflicts, belligerents had fought on battlefields while generally honoring financial contracts and commercial obligations. Britain shattered this norm, demonstrating that sterling assets could be weaponized against political enemies regardless of contractual protections or property rights. The immediate effect on Germany was devastating. German companies lost assets worth hundreds of millions across the global empire. German banks found themselves cut off from London capital markets, unable to finance trade or access credit. German international commerce collapsed as the pound-based payment system rejected German participation. British policymakers believed this financial strangulation would provide decisive advantage, potentially shortening the war by denying Germany access to international resources. But neutral countries observed this weaponization with growing alarm and drew a dangerous conclusion for British interests. If London could seize German assets during wartime, it could theoretically seize anyone's assets during any conflict Britain deems sufficiently important. Your reserves held in sterling weren't truly safe unless Britain approved of your government's policies and alliances. Financial assets that you believed were protected by law and contract could disappear with a parliamentary vote. After World War I ended in 1918, neutral nations that had watched this precedent began systematically diversifying their reserves away from exclusive sterling dependence. They increased gold holdings. They established accounts in New York, Paris, and other emerging financial centers. They reduced their vulnerability to British political decisions. The United States benefited enormously from this diversification. American banks, particularly those in New York, gained business that previously flowed automatically to London. By 1920, the United States held more gold reserves than Britain, a stunning reversal of the pre-war balance. By 1925, New York rivaled London as a financial center, attracting international capital that no longer trusted concentrated exposure to British policy. By 1944, at the Bretton Woods Conference that redesigned the post-war monetary system, the dollar formally replaced the pound as the world's primary reserve currency.
Britain's financial weaponization in 1914 initiated a 30-year decline from absolute dominance to secondary status, a decline accelerated by 2 world wars but fundamentally rooted in the loss of trust caused by asset seizures. The second historical example occurred in 1979 when Iranian revolutionaries seized American embassy staff in Tehran, taking 52 diplomats hostage. President Jimmy Carter responded by freezing all Iranian assets held in U.S. financial institutions, approximately $12 billion, including $8 billion in bank deposits and $4 billion in other assets. This represented the largest asset freeze in history at that point, and the justification seemed ironclad. Iran had violated international law by taking diplomats hostage, and the United States was defending its citizens through economic pressure rather than military force. The freeze did create substantial pressure on Tehran. Iranian oil revenues deposited in U.S. banks became inaccessible. Iran couldn't access its own money to purchase imports or service international debts. The economic pain contributed to the eventual release of the hostages in January 1981. Tactically, the weapon worked, but strategically, the freeze sent shockwaves through every capital holding dollar reserves, particularly in the Middle East and OPEC nations. These countries suddenly realized that sovereign wealth funds denominated in dollars and held in New York banks weren't actually sovereign. An American president could freeze these assets with a single executive order, no congressional approval required, no judicial review necessary, just a phone call to the Treasury Department. The response was predictable and rational. Throughout the 1980s, OPEC countries systematically diversified their reserve holdings. Dollar reserves as a percentage of total reserves fell from approximately 85% in 1977 to about 71% by 1991. Middle Eastern sovereign wealth funds increased holdings of Deutschmarks, Japanese yen, and physical gold. They established accounts in London, Zurich, Singapore, anywhere that wasn't exclusively under U.S. jurisdiction. Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and the United Arab Emirates all reduced their U.S. Treasury holdings relative to total reserves. The dollar share of global reserves began a slow, persistent decline that continues 4 decades later. The Iranian freeze worked tactically by pressuring Tehran, but failed strategically by teaching the entire world that dollar reserves could be seized for political reasons. Every finance minister drew the obvious lesson: diversify away from concentrated dollar exposure. Never again hold such a large percentage of national wealth in a form that a foreign government could freeze. The United States gained leverage over Iran but lost trust from everyone else, including allies who recognized they could face similar treatment during any future dispute with Washington.
The fourth example is the 2022 Russian SWIFT exclusion itself, the event that brought all previous patterns into sharp focus and accelerated de-dollarization faster than any previous episode in financial history. On February 26, 2022, the United States and European Union announced that major Russian banks would be disconnected from SWIFT, and simultaneously, $300 billion in Russian central bank reserves held in Western financial institutions would be frozen. This was the ultimate escalation, the nuclear option that previous administrations had considered but never deployed. Russia was being subjected to financial isolation on a scale never before attempted against a major economy. The immediate effect was dramatic and seemingly decisive. The ruble crashed 30% within 2 days as panicked Russians rushed to convert savings into dollars or euros. The Russian stock market was forced to close entirely to prevent catastrophic collapse. ATMs across Moscow and St. Petersburg ran out of cash as citizens withdrew funds, fearing bank failures or currency controls. Western media outlets declared economic victory, with headlines proclaiming that Russia would collapse within months, that Putin's regime couldn't survive the financial shock, that the war in Ukraine would end quickly due to economic implosion. But then something entirely unexpected occurred that shattered Western assumptions about financial power. Russia stabilized. The Russian central bank hiked interest rates to 20%, a drastic move that halted the ruble's fall by making ruble-denominated assets extremely attractive. Russia demanded that European countries purchase natural gas in rubles rather than euros, creating artificial demand for the currency and supporting its value. Capital controls prevented money from fleeing the country. Within 3 months, the ruble had recovered all its losses, returning to pre-sanction exchange rates.
Russian trade continued flowing, just not through Western channels or in Western currencies. Russia redirected oil and gas exports to China, India, and Middle Eastern buyers willing to purchase at discounted prices using non-dollar currencies. Russia settled trade with China in yuan and rubles through China's SIPS system, the cross-border interbank payment system that Beijing had been developing for exactly this scenario. Russia traded with India largely in rupees, with some transactions even reverting to Soviet-era barter arrangements where Russian oil was exchanged directly for Indian goods. By late 2022, Russia's economy had stabilized far faster than Western analysts predicted. By 2023, Russian GDP actually grew 3.6%, outpacing Germany and the United Kingdom, both of which experienced stagnation. But the real damage from the SWIFT weapon wasn't inflicted on Russia. The real damage was inflicted on the dollar and on the trust that underpins any reserve currency system. Every country observing these events understood with perfect clarity that the United States would freeze reserves and cut off SWIFT access for political reasons, setting a precedent that made dollar reserves fundamentally unsafe for any nation that might ever conflict with Washington. If you're China, sitting on over $3 trillion in foreign reserves, you're calculating what would happen if a crisis over Taiwan escalated. Could the U.S. freeze those reserves just as it froze Russia's? The precedent says yes, absolutely. If you're India, managing complex relationships with both Washington and Moscow, you're wondering whether your dollar reserves are safe if you don't align perfectly with American foreign policy. If you're Saudi Arabia, an 80-year U.S. ally, you're reconsidering whether that alliance guarantees protection or simply delays inevitable vulnerability. This realization triggered the 5-stage backfire pattern that has repeated throughout history, but this time compressed into a dramatically shorter time frame due to modern technology and digital payment systems. Stage 1 is dominant power controls the payment system. From 1973, when SWIFT was created, until 2022, the United States effectively controlled international payments through its dominance of both SWIFT and the dollar. SWIFT is technically headquartered in Belgium and governed by a multinational board. But because the vast majority of international transactions settle in dollars through New York correspondent banks, Washington possesses ultimate leverage. The U.S. Treasury can sanction banks that don't comply with American policy. The Federal Reserve can deny access to dollar clearing systems. SWIFT cannot function effectively without U.S. cooperation, which means controlling the dollar is equivalent to controlling SWIFT. Stage 2 is weaponization for foreign policy objectives. From 2001 onward, the United States increasingly deployed financial sanctions as a primary tool of statecraft. After September 11th attacks, the focus was terrorist financing, cutting off al-Qaeda's access to the banking system. This gradually expanded to rogue states like Iran and North Korea, then to Russia after Crimea in 2014. Each escalation normalized financial warfare as standard policy, creating precedent and building infrastructure for sanctions enforcement. By 2022, when Russia invaded Ukraine, using the SWIFT weapon seemed obvious and inevitable. The legal framework existed, the technical capability existed, the political will existed. So Washington pulled the trigger and cut Russia off while freezing $300 billion in reserves. Stage 3 is targets find alternatives, and this is where Russia proved that survival outside the dollar SWIFT system is entirely possible. Russia couldn't use SWIFT, so Russia used SPFS domestically and SIPS internationally for trade with China. Russia couldn't settle in dollars, so Russia settled in yuan, rubles, and rupees. Cryptocurrency facilitated some transactions, particularly smaller ones where traditional banking was impossible. Barter arrangements emerged for certain commodities. By 2024, approximately 40% of Russian trade was conducted in currencies other than dollars or euros, a staggering shift from the 87% dollar-euro share in 2021. Russia-China bilateral trade reached $240 billion in 2023, with virtually all transactions settled in yuan or rubles completely bypassing the dollar system. Russia-India trade hit $65 billion, largely in rupees. Russia proved definitively that you can be cut off from SWIFT and the dollar system and not only survive but continue functioning as a major trading nation.